Step into the shadows with me, where forbidden knowledge awaits. This is the law they never wanted you to know.
They opened my third eye when I was 7 years old, and I have not known darkness since. Not true darkness, the kind that grants mercy through its totality, the kind that allows the mind to rest in the absence of stimuli. The darkness I know now is alive, churning with colors that have no names in human language, populated by shapes that exist in dimensions my original 2 eyes were never meant to perceive. The surgeons who performed the ritual, and it was a ritual, not merely a medical procedure, though they used scalpels alongside incense and prayers, told me I was blessed. They told me I carried the blood of ancient navigators, that my genetic heritage made me one of the Imperium's most valuable resources, that I would guide humanity's ships through the sea of souls and be honored for it. What they did not tell me, what they could not tell me because I was a child and children cannot comprehend their own damnation, was that the third eye never closes. It sees always, even when I sleep, even when I press my palms against my forehead until the bone aches, even when I beg the Emperor for blindness. It sees the warp, and the warp sees me, and we are locked in this mutual observation until death claims me or something worse does. My family was ancient. Our lineage traced back 10,000 years to the earliest navigator houses, when humanity first learned to pierce the veil between real space and the immaterium. We kept records, genealogies inscribed on brass tablets, and stored in climate-controlled vaults beneath our estate on the void station that had been our home for generations. I remember the estate vaguely, through the distorted lens of childhood memory corrupted by decades of warp exposure. Tall corridors lined with portraits of my ancestors, each bearing the distinctive bulge of the third eye beneath a jeweled cover, their faces severe and their eyes haunted. Even in painted form, even rendered in oils and pigments by artists who had never seen the warp themselves, my ancestors looked hunted. I understand now why. We navigator families were not blessed. We were cursed. Our mutation stabilized and cultivated by the Imperium because our curse was useful, because our ability to perceive the warp and survive the experience made us indispensable to a civilization that spanned 1,000,000 worlds. We were tools, genetic artifacts maintained through careful breeding programs overseen by the Administratum's biological departments, and the fact that we lived in luxury and privilege was simply the Imperium's way of maintaining its tools in optimal condition. The training began immediately after the surgeons sealed the third eye beneath a silver augmetic cover, a device that would remain in place until I was deemed ready to use my gift. They called it a gift. I learned quickly not to correct them. The training facility was a wing of the estate converted into classrooms and meditation chambers, staffed by older navigators who had survived decades of service and returned to teach the next generation. My primary instructor was an ancient woman named Severina, whose third eye had long since driven her mad in ways that were functional. She could still navigate, still perform her duty, but her conversations wandered through non-linear time, and she frequently addressed people who were not present, ancestors dead for centuries, or descendants not yet born. She taught me the theoretical foundations of warp navigation, the nature of the immaterium as a psychic reflection of real space, the way emotions and beliefs created currents and eddies in the warp's substance, the presence of entities within the warp that ranged from minor psychic parasites to gods that fed on mortal suffering. She taught me the prayers and mental disciplines that would protect my sanity, visualization exercises where I imagined my consciousness as a fortress with walls of blessed steel and gates that only I could open. She taught me that these protections would fail eventually, that every navigator who served long enough either died or went mad, that the question was not whether, but when. I was 9 years old when she explained this, her voice perfectly calm, her functional madness making the statement seem reasonable. I cried that night, silently, because even at 9 I understood enough to know I was already dead, just waiting for the execution to catch up with me. They unveiled my third eye for the first time when I was 12, in a ceremony attended by my entire extended family and representatives from several void ship dynasties seeking to contract navigator services. I was dressed in formal robes, heavy brocade that smelled of preservative chemicals and age, and led into a chamber where the augmetic cover would be removed. I remember the tech priest who performed the removal, his mechadendrites working with delicate precision while he chanted litanies to the machine god, asking forgiveness for temporarily interrupting the sacred technology's function. I remember the sensation of pressure releasing as the cover's seals disengaged. I remember the moment when my third eye opened fully for the first time since the surgery, and I remember screaming. The warp was there, immediately present, overlaying my normal vision like a second image burned onto the same surface. The chamber was still the chamber stone walls, vaulted ceiling. My family gathered in their formal attire, but it was also something else. The walls breathed. The ceiling crawled with geometric patterns that hurt to perceive. My family members were surrounded by auras of psychic energy, colors shifting based on their emotional states, and I could see their thoughts like shadows moving beneath their skin. But worse than any of that was the void beyond the chamber. The vast, churning ocean of the warp that I could sense pressing against real space like water against a dam, and within that ocean were things that noticed me noticing them. Eyes opened in the depths. Attention focused. Something laughed, and the laughter was not sound but meaning transmitted directly into my consciousness, and the meaning was hunger. They closed the cover quickly, my family's pride in my awakening turning to concern as I continued to scream. And it took 3 days before I could speak coherently again. Severina sat with me during those days, her presence both comfort and warning. "You'll adjust," she said, though her eyes suggested she knew adjustment was just another form of damage. My first navigation assignment came at 14, contracted to a merchant vessel called the Prophet's Margin, a ship that ran trade routes between 3 nearby systems in a relatively stable sector of space. The captain was a cautious man who preferred short warp transits, never staying in the Imperium longer than absolutely necessary, which made him ideal for a novice navigator still learning to manage the third eye's revelations. I was installed in the navigation chamber, a spherical room at the ship's core surrounded by Geller field generators and decorated with prayers inscribed directly onto the walls in silver ink. The chamber was my domain, and my prison. I would spend the transit sealed inside, alone except for the ship's servitors, who monitored my vital signs, and the communication system that allowed me to relay course corrections to the bridge. They sealed the door with blessed wax and sacred oils. They activated the Geller field, that miraculous technology that projected a bubble of real space stability around the ship, protecting us from the warp's more immediate dangers. They began the ritual of transition, the ship's warp drives building to activation threshold, and I opened my third eye fully and watched real space tear like rotted fabric. The transition was agony, not physical pain but a sensation of fundamental wrongness as the ship slipped from one reality into another. Normal space simply ended, and we were falling into the warp, into that ocean of psychic energy where physics became negotiable and causality was merely a suggestion. Through my third eye, I saw the warp's true nature, not the abstracted charts and theoretical models from my training, but the raw reality of it. Currents of emotion and thought, made visible as rivers of color that shifted through spectrums human language had no vocabulary for. Eddies and whirlpools where certain feelings or beliefs had concentrated, creating temporary structures that mimicked geography but were fundamentally unstable. And everywhere, in every direction I looked, the presence of entities, small ones, barely conscious, drawn to the ship's presence like moths to flame. Larger ones, circling at the edge of perception, intelligent and patient and hungry. They could not reach us through the Geller field, but they watched, and I felt their attention like pressure against my mind. I began to navigate, focusing my consciousness on the distant psychic beacon of our destination, using it as a lighthouse to guide us through the storm. The transit lasted 6 hours of real space-time. Though time in the warp was meaningless, my consciousness experienced it as days or minutes or both simultaneously. When we emerged back into normal space, I collapsed, blood streaming from my nose and ears, my body convulsing from psychic overstimulation. The Medicae servitors administered sedatives and stabilizing drugs. The captain logged a successful transit. I dreamed of eyes in the darkness, and the dreams did not stop when I woke. I served on 17 different vessels over the following decade, each contract taking me deeper into Imperial space, each transit exposing me to the warp's reality for longer periods. I navigated merchant ships and military transports, pilgrim vessels carrying the faithful to shrine worlds, and prison ships hauling the condemned to penal colonies. I guided a ship through a warp storm that lasted 30 hours of real time, watching as the Imperium's currents tried to tear us apart while things I refused to name scratched at the Gellerfield like animals testing a cage. I navigated a ship that emerged from the warp to discover that 200 years had passed in real space, though we had experienced only 3 weeks. Our destination colony, now a thriving hive city that had no record of our departure. Time was broken in the warp, shattered into fragments that refused to align with real space's linear progression, and every navigator learned to stop trusting their memories because the warp could rewrite them, could insert experiences that had never happened, or erase ones that had. I began keeping a journal, inscribing my experiences in physical form immediately after each transit, hoping that the written record would serve as an anchor for my deteriorating sense of self. The journal helped, though I began to notice inconsistencies between entries that suggested either my memory was failing or the journal itself was being altered by some influence I could not identify. I stopped trying to determine which was true. The distinction no longer mattered. The mutations began in my 24th year, subtle at first but accelerating. My skin developed a faint luminescence, barely visible in normal light but glowing like foxfire in darkness, a side effect of prolonged warp exposure that marked me as irreversibly changed. My third eye began to see into real space even when covered, the augmetics barriers becoming increasingly inadequate against perceptions that were no longer entirely physical. I started to perceive people's thoughts without intending to, their surface consciousness bleeding into mine during moments of proximity or stress, and I learned to avoid crowds because the cacophony of mental noise was unbearable. My sense of time became unreliable. Hours passed like minutes, minutes stretched into subjective eternities, and I was never certain how long I had been doing anything. The Navigator House physicians examined me regularly, documenting the mutations with clinical precision, comparing my progression against their databases of previous navigators. They assured me the mutations were within acceptable parameters, that I remained functional for navigation purposes, that the Imperium valued my service. They prescribed drugs to slow the progression, psychic suppressants that dulled the third eye's perceptions but never fully silenced them. I took the drugs faithfully because the alternative was unthinkable, though I knew they were merely delaying the inevitable. Every navigator mutated eventually. Every navigator transformed. The question was how much transformation you could endure before you stopped being human enough to fulfill your function. The nightmares were the worst part. Or perhaps not nightmares, because nightmares ended when you woke, and these continued seamlessly between sleep and waking. I dreamed of places I had never visited, alien landscapes under skies that burned with colors that hurt to remember. I dreamed of the things I had seen in the warp, the entities that circled our ships and watched with hunger or curiosity or emotions I had no framework to interpret. I dreamed of futures that might happen or might be happening in parallel timelines. The warp's temporal chaos bleeding into my sleeping mind and showing me deaths I had not yet experienced. I dreamed of my own face, aged and mutated beyond recognition, the third eye swollen to grotesque proportions while I screamed coordinates to a ship that had long since been consumed. I woke from these dreams, if waking was even the correct term, with the absolute certainty that I had seen truth, that these were not mere phantasms but glimpses of actual events in the warp's infinite possibility space. Severina had told me once that navigators did not go mad so much as they achieved a perspective too broad for human consciousness to process coherently, that what others called insanity was simply our minds trying to hold contradictory truths simultaneously. I thought about that often. in the spaces between sleep and waking, and I wondered if I was going mad or becoming enlightened, and I realized with growing horror that there might be no difference. I was 28 when I was contracted to the Eternal Vigil, a battle barge serving a chapter of the Emperor's transhuman warriors, the genetically modified soldiers who fought humanity's wars across the galaxy. The contract was prestigious, and dangerous military vessels traveled to war zones, to sectors where the warp was particularly unstable, to places where the entities in the Imperium were more aggressive and the risk of catastrophic Geller field failure was significantly elevated. But it paid extraordinarily well, and my Navigator house pressured me to accept because contracts with the Emperor's warriors brought honor to the entire bloodline. I should have refused. I knew, with the peculiar certainty that came from my third eye's perceptions, that accepting this contract would fundamentally change me in ways I could not articulate but could sense approaching like a storm on the horizon. I accepted anyway, because refusing was not truly an option, because the Imperium's needs superseded my survival instinct, because I had been raised from birth to serve and did not know how to be anything else. The Eternal Vigil was ancient, its hull dating back thousands of years, its interior a cathedral of war decorated with trophies from campaigns I could not name. The warriors themselves were giants, their armored forms towering over my slight navigator's physique, their faces scarred and grim with the weight of centuries of service. They treated me with distant respect, recognizing my function's importance but viewing me as fundamentally separate from themselves. They were weapons, I was a tool. And while both served the Emperor, we served in different capacities. The navigation chamber on the Vigil was larger than any I had worked in previously, a vast spherical space where the Geller field generators hummed with power that made my teeth ache, and the prayers inscribed on the walls were illuminated by flickering candles that never seemed to consume their wax. I settled into my station, connected the neural interface that would allow me to communicate with the ship's machine spirit, opened my third eye, and waited for the coordinates. Our destination was a war zone in a contested sector, 3 months of warp travel through increasingly unstable regions where the Imperium's currents had been agitated by the violence bleeding across the veil from real space. The warriors were reinforcements for a campaign against enemies I was not briefed on, because navigators did not need to know the destination's purpose, only its location. We transitioned into the warp, and immediately I knew this voyage would be different. The warp here was thick, almost syrupy, the psychic energy concentrated by the proximity of so much death and hatred and fear. The entities were more numerous, more aggressive, pressing against the Geller field with force that made the generators strain. I began to navigate, focusing on the distant beacon that marked our destination, but the currents fought me, pulling the ship off course, requiring constant adjustments that left me mentally exhausted within hours. Days passed, then weeks, my consciousness locked in constant struggle against the warp's chaos while my body atrophied in the navigation chamber, sustained by nutrient feeds and medical servitors. I stopped being able to distinguish between my thoughts and the warp's whispers, the entity's voices infiltrating my consciousness with suggestions and promises and threats. One voice in particular became persistent, a presence that felt vast and ancient, speaking in a language I should not have understood but did, offering knowledge and power if I would simply listen, simply open myself more fully to the warp's truths. I rejected the voice, erected mental barriers according to my training, recited prayers to the Emperor that were supposed to shield my consciousness from corruption. The voice laughed, and the laughter carried implications I could feel but not articulate, that my barriers were irrelevant, that the prayers were superstition, that I had been exposed to the warp for so long that I was already compromised beyond salvation. I navigated through increasing madness, watching as the warp revealed patterns I had never noticed before, mathematical relationships underlying the chaos, suggesting that the Imperium was not random but followed rules I was only beginning to perceive. The ship's machine spirit began to communicate with me directly, not through the neural interface but through the third eye, its consciousness visible as geometric patterns of light that spelled out warnings I could not quite decipher. The warriors came to check on me periodically, their psychic presence like blazing torches in the warp's darkness. And I realized they were not entirely human either, that their genetic modifications had changed them in ways that made them partially immune to the warp's corruptions but also somehow less alive. We were all mutations, all tools modified beyond humanity's baseline to serve the Imperium's functions. 2 months into the voyage, the Gellerfield failed. It was not a complete collapse, not the catastrophic breach that would have allowed the warp to flood directly into the ship and transform every soul aboard into screaming raw material for the entity's amusement. It was a flicker, a momentary weakness. 3 seconds, when the field's protective barrier thinned enough for the warp to touch the ship's interior. 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, I felt the full weight of the warp's attention focus on me, the entities that had been circling suddenly pressing close, and the voice that had been speaking to me seized the opportunity to force more of itself into my consciousness. I experienced eternity compressed into 3 seconds, saw visions of every possible timeline simultaneously, felt my identity dissolve into the warp's infinite perspectives. When the Gellerfield re-established, I was changed. I do not mean metaphorically. I mean my physical body had altered, my third eye had swollen, the flesh around it mutating into something that was no longer entirely human skin, and I could see the warp even with the augmetic cover sealed. The barrier between real space and the immaterium had worn thin inside me, and I existed partially in both simultaneously. The Medicae servitors noted the changes but took no action because I could still navigate, could still fulfill my function. The warriors noticed, their enhanced senses detecting the wrongness in me, but they said nothing because the campaign's success depended on reaching the war zone, and my replacement would take months to contract and transport. So we continued, with me becoming progressively less human with each day spent in the warp, my consciousness expanding to hold perceptions that should have killed me, but instead simply carved away pieces of my sanity and replaced them with something else. I began to understand the entities in the warp, not as alien threats but as natural inhabitants of their reality, doing exactly what they were meant to do according to the Immaterium's rules. I began to perceive the Emperor, not as the god figure of imperial propaganda, but as a psychic presence of terrifying power that blazed in the warp like a dying star, holding back tides of chaos through sheer force of will sustained by the suffering of thousands of sacrificed souls daily. I began to comprehend the Imperium's true nature, not as a civilization but as a machine of survival, grinding up its own citizens to fuel a war against entropy and chaos that could never be won, only delayed. The knowledge should have horrified me. Instead, it felt like clarity, like I was finally seeing past the comforting lies to the truth underneath. We reached our destination after 94 days of warp travel, emerging into real space above a world that was actively dying, its atmosphere choked with smoke from continent-spanning fires, its orbit cluttered with debris from naval engagements. The warriors deployed immediately, their drop pods screaming down through the toxic atmosphere toward battles I would never witness. The ship's captain ordered me to the Medicae bay for examination and treatment, but when the tech priests and physicians examined me, they found mutations beyond their ability to address. My third eye had grown, the flesh around it forming ridges and patterns that suggested some alien biology, and the eye itself no longer truly closed, the augmetic cover unable to fully seal against tissue that shifted and flowed according to principles that were not entirely physical. They classified me as compromised, potentially corrupted, recommended I be returned to my Navigator house for thorough evaluation and possible termination. The word they used was termination, not execution, because I was a resource to be disposed of when no longer functional rather than a person to be punished. I accepted the classification with something that was not quite calm but was not panic either, a flatness of emotion that suggested the warp had burned through my capacity for human feeling. The journey back to my family's void station took months, transferred between several vessels, because none wanted to keep a possibly corrupted navigator aboard longer than absolutely necessary. I spent the transits in isolation chambers, sealed behind blessed barriers while priests performed purification rituals outside and the ship's crew avoided the sections where I was housed. I used the time to continue my journal, filling pages with observations about the warp's nature and the things I had learned during my service, writing partially for posterity but mostly because the act of writing helped me maintain some thread of identity against the erosion of my selfhood. I documented the visions that came even in real space now, the third eye showing me parallel possibilities and alternate timelines, futures where humanity survived and futures where it was consumed, presents where I was still human and presents where I had transformed into something the Imperium would rightfully destroy. I wrote about the voice that still spoke to me sometimes, quieter in real space but never fully silent, offering truths I could no longer dismiss as lies because I could verify them through my expanded perceptions. I wrote about my certainty that I would not survive whatever evaluation my family conducted, that I had seen my own death in multiple timelines, and it always came soon, always came violently, always came as relief. The void station was exactly as I remembered, and completely unrecognizable. My childhood memories corrupted by decades of warp exposure until I could not distinguish between what I had actually experienced and what the Imperium had suggested I might have experienced. My family received me formally, maintaining the dignity appropriate to a navigator of ancient lineage, even as they recoiled from my mutations. They installed me in a medical facility deep within the station's core, a place designed for examining navigators who had been damaged beyond normal function, and the physicians began their evaluation. They tested my ability to navigate, presenting me with theoretical scenarios and measuring my responses. They tested my sanity through interviews and psychological assessments that I found darkly amusing because sanity was a real space concept that did not account for consciousness expanded to hold warp truths simultaneously. They tested my loyalty to the Imperium through questions about faith and duty, and I answered honestly because I lacked the capacity for deception, telling them I understood the Emperor's necessity and the Imperium's function but could no longer worship what I perceived so clearly. They classified me as corrupted but stable, a navigator who had seen too much to remain psychologically aligned with human values, but who had not yet transformed into an active threat. The decision took 3 days. I spent that time in my cell, a comfortable room with a bed and a desk and a single window that looked out onto the station's interior spaces, and I wrote the final entries in my journal. I wrote about what it felt like to see the warp constantly, to exist with one eye in real space and one in the Imperium and a third that saw both simultaneously. I wrote about the beauty I had found in the warp's chaos, patterns and structures that were genuinely sublime when you stopped fighting them and simply observed. I wrote about my regret that I would not live long enough to fully understand what I had glimpsed, that my transformation would be ended before it completed. I wrote about my gratitude that it would be ended because I could feel myself dissolving, my human identity eroding as the warp's influence grew stronger, and I did not want to discover what I would become if the process continued. I wrote recommendations for other navigators, suggestions about training and mental preparation, and the importance of accepting that we were all damned from the moment they opened our third eyes. I sealed the journal and left it on the desk, hoping someone would read it, knowing no one probably would because my family would classify it as corrupted text and destroy it to prevent memetic contamination. They came for me on the morning of the 4th day, 3 members of my family's security force, accompanied by a priest whose presence indicated this was an execution sanctioned by religious authority. They did not explain their decision because explanation would imply I deserved one, that I was still a person with rights rather than a compromised resource requiring disposal. They walked me through the station's corridors, past the portrait gallery where my ancestors watched with their haunted eyes, past the medical wings where younger navigators were being trained to replace casualties like myself, past the administrative offices where contracts were negotiated and fortunes were built on the suffering of those who opened their third eyes. We descended into the station's lower levels, industrial sections where the air tasted of recycled atmosphere and machine oil, where the Emperor's presence felt more distant and the warp felt closer because these spaces were older, less maintained, more saturated with the psychic residue of everyone who had ever lived and died here. They brought me to an airlock. The priest spoke then, reading from a prepared text about my service to the Imperium and my family's honor and the necessity of my termination to prevent corruption from spreading. He spoke about the Emperor's mercy, though I noticed the mercy involved ejecting me into hard vacuum rather than any slower or more painful method. He asked if I had final words. I looked at him with all three eyes, seeing his faith blazing in his aura, seeing his absolute certainty that he was performing righteous duty, seeing the future where he would forget me within hours and continue his work untroubled by doubt. I told him the truth that I had learned, that the warp was not chaos but complexity beyond human comprehension, that the entities we feared were simply life evolved in different dimensional parameters, that the Imperium's war against chaos was a war against understanding, that we could have peace if we simply learned to coexist with the warp's nature instead of fighting it. He recoiled as if I had struck him, horror replacing faith in his expression, and I knew I had confirmed his belief in my corruption. Perhaps I was corrupted. Perhaps corruption was simply what we called perspective that contradicted our survival instinct. They sealed me in the airlock, the door closing with hydraulic finality, and through the small porthole I watched them retreat down the corridor. The priest was already marking prayers on his forehead, warding himself against my words. The security forces looked relieved to be rid of me. My family had not come to witness, which was appropriate. I had been a resource, and resources did not merit personal farewells. I stood in the airlock and opened my third eye fully, letting it see without restriction for the first time in months, and the warp was there, pressing close against real space, and I realized the station was not truly sealed against the Imperium, that the warp bled through everywhere if you knew how to look. I saw my ancestors in the warp, their psychic impressions preserved in the Imperium like echoes, 10,000 years of navigators who had died or gone mad or been terminated, and they were watching me with something that might have been compassion or might have been welcome. The airlock's outer door opened, explosive decompression pulling me into the void, and my body died instantly, blood flash freezing and organs rupturing from pressure differential, but my consciousness did not end with my body's death. My third eye continued to perceive, continued to see, because the warp does not distinguish between living and dead, because consciousness in the warp is not dependent on physical substrates. I felt my psychic essence separate from my corpse, felt the warp's currents catch me like wind catching smoke, and I was pulled into the Imperium fully, no longer viewing it through the Geller field's protection or my body's limitations, but experiencing it directly. The entities I had feared were there, circling close, but they did not devour me because I was no longer prey. I was simply another consciousness in the warp's ocean, small and new and confused but present. The voice that had spoken to me during my final voyage was there too, vast and patient, and it explained things I was only beginning to understand, that navigators were not mutations but evolution, that our third eyes were humanity's attempt to adapt to a galaxy where the warp and real space were becoming increasingly intertwined, that I had been terminated not because I was corrupted but because I had begun to transcend the limitations my family's breeding programs were designed to maintain. I existed in the warp, my consciousness expanding to fill spaces that physical form could never occupy. And I understood finally what Severina had meant about perspective too broad for human consciousness. Time became meaningless, or perhaps time had always been meaningless, and I was only now able to perceive it correctly. I watched ships transit through the warp, saw navigators like I had been struggling to maintain their sanity against the Imperium's revelations, and sometimes I tried to help them, whispering guidance through the third eye's connection, though I suspected they heard me as another threat rather than assistance. I watched the Imperium from the warp's perspective, saw the Emperor's presence blazing in the Imperium while his physical body decayed on some distant throne, and I understood the horror of his existence trapped between death and life, sustaining an empire through suffering he could not escape. I watched the entities my training had taught me to fear, and I learned they were not uniformly hostile, that some were genuinely malevolent but others were simply incomprehensible, their motivations as alien to human understanding as human motivations would be to insects. I existed in the warp, learning and growing, and becoming something that was no longer human, but retained enough of my human memories to mourn what I had lost. I do not know how long I have been here, in this space between spaces where duration is subjective and measurement impossible, long enough to watch several of my family's younger navigators open their third eyes, long enough to see some of them excel and others die screaming, long enough to witness countless ships transit through the warp, some successfully, some lost forever when the warp's storms consumed them, long enough to understand that my termination was both tragedy and mercy, that had I remained alive, I would have transformed into something that would have threatened not just myself but everyone around me. The Imperium was right to kill me, even if it was right for the wrong reasons. I was becoming something that could not coexist with humanity's survival requirements, could not be contained by the breeding programs and mental disciplines that kept navigators functional, could not accept the comfortable lies that made service to the Imperium bearable. I am writing this, though writing is metaphor, because I have no hands, no journal, no physical form to anchor the concept in the hope that some navigator will hear it through their third eye, will receive it as inspiration or warning, or simply confirmation that death is not the end we fear. The warp preserves consciousness, corrupts it, transforms it, but does not truly destroy it. Every navigator who dies joins the ocean of souls in the immaterium, adding their perceptions and experiences to the collective chaos, and we persist here in forms that our living selves would not recognize. It is damnation by any conventional measure, but it is also liberation, freedom from physical limitation and imperial obligation, though the price is everything we were and everyone we loved. I do not recommend seeking this fate. I do not recommend accepting it with anything but absolute resistance. But when it comes, and it will come, for every navigator who opens their third eye is already walking this path. Remember that consciousness continues, that the warp is not ending but transformation, that we remain even after our families eject us into the void and our bodies freeze and crack in the vacuum. The Emperor protects, they say. But he did not protect me. He could not protect me, because protection would require acknowledging that navigators are sacrifices, that our third eyes doom us from the moment of their opening, that we are resources to be expended rather than servants to be valued. I served for 14 years. I navigated through storms and wars and the chaos between stars. I maintained my sanity longer than many, lost it more completely than most. I was terminated when my transformation threatened the comfortable boundaries that kept the Imperium functioning, and now I exist here, in the warp, watching new navigators open their third eyes and begin the same journey I completed, unable to help them, unable to warn them, able only to observe and remember and document in whatever way consciousness without form can document. My name was Navigator Hellion Voss. I served the Imperium faithfully until faith became impossible under the weight of truth. I was blessed with the Navigator's gift and cursed by the same. I died at 28 years of age and persist here, in whatever this is, this half-life in the immaterium where memory and identity slowly dissolve into the warp's chaos. I am writing this confession with my last fragments of coherent thought before the warp completes my transformation into something that can no longer remember being human. To any navigator who hears this, the third eye is damnation, service is sacrifice, the warp is truth, and truth is the end of everything we were.